السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. طلابي الأعزاء، طلاب الفرقة الثالثة بكلية العلاج الطبيعي، أهلا بيكم بتالت محاضرة معانا في مقررنا Scientific Thinking. In first session and the second session we speak about thinking in general, the nature of thinking, how can we define thinking, and we talk about some elements of thinking process, and we talk about some types of thinking. Now we will start with chapter 2. We will recognize about scientific thinking. First, we can define scientific thinking as a type of thinking. How can we define scientific thinking? Number one, we can say scientific thinking is processes of logical thinking. Scientific thinking is the process of logical thinking and analysis to find truth through certain patterns of thinking. We can say scientific thinking is the process of logical thinking and analysis. We use logical thinking and analysis to find truth through certain patterns of thinking. We also say scientific thinking is the process of finding truth based on certain thinking. The scientific thinking is the process of finding truth. Find the truth through scientific thinking, through some types of thinking, through patterns of thinking. Okay, which are marked by two characteristics. Such as being logical and analysis, and using logical thinking or using logic. Until now, we define scientific thinking as a process. This is a process of logical thinking and analysis. To what? To find some truth through certain patterns of thinking, which are marked by two characteristics, such as being logical and analytical, and using certain pattern of logical thinking or using certain logic. We use some activities in the scientific thinking. Thinking activities to be able to think scientifically by human contains some skills, some thinking skills. When we use some activities to think, thinking activities which we use to be able to scientific thinking or think with scientifically by humans contain some thinking skills. These some thinking skills that are structured as a part of scientific thinking or structured in a particular series. We can also say scientific thinking is the process. It's the process of obtaining the truth through the facts on an event. Again, scientific thinking is the process of obtaining the facts or obtaining truth through facts on an event. After finding the facts and truths which contained in an event, and then it is analyzed logically. So we can say the ability to think scientifically includes the ability to think logically, analytical, systematically, deductive, and inductive. When we use the ability of scientific thinking, we use variety of thinking. So we say the ability to think scientifically includes what? Includes the ability to think logically, systematically, analytical or analysis, deductive and inductive. In solving problems, in an effort to find the truth. Until now, we recognize the ability of thinking scientifically as a variety of abilities, such as ability to think logically, ability to think systematically, think analytical, deductive, and inductive. But now, scientific thinking, or the ability to think scientifically, doesn't just doesn't just happen to everyone or every student, every learner, but needs to be trained, why? To be developed, or in order to develop properly, so that students can use scientific thinking, think logically, can use think systematically, think analytically, think deductive and inductive in addressing every problems we have that occurs as a part of scientific thinking. Again, the scientific thinking ability, or ability to think scientifically, includes some abilities, such as includes ability to think logically, systematically, analytically, deductive and inductive, in problem solving, in an effort to find the truth. The scientific thinking, or the ability to think scientifically, doesn't just happen to every student, to every learner, everybody, but needs to be trained in order to develop. So the students or the learner can think logically, systematically, analytical, deductive, and inductive in addressing every problem that we face it in our life, in our school, in our college, and so on, that occurs as a part of scientific thinking. Until now, we recognize about scientific thinking as a process. This is a process of logical thinking, analysis, and find the truth and facts. When we speak about the ability to think scientifically, we speak about some abilities. Scientific ability includes the ability to think systematically, analytical, deductive and inductive and logical. These ability have variety of abilities. Doesn't just happen to everyone, but needs to be trained to develop it. When we develop it, the students, the learners can think logically, can think systematically, can think logically, analysis, deductive, inductive, in addressing every problems that occurs as a part of scientific thinking. Now we will recognize about the characteristics of good or well scientific thinker. Scientific thinker, which ability they have, what can do. Well cultivated scientific thinking do some things, do some happens, such as raises vital situation, raises vital scientific or scientific questions, formatting them clearly. Number two, gather and assessing what relevant scientific data and information. Number one, raises vital scientific problems and questions, formulating clear. Okay. Number two, gathering, assessing the relevant scientific data and information, using abstract idea to what? To interpret them effectively. Until now, scientific thinker have done what? Number one, raises vital scientific questions and problems, formulating them clearly. Okay. Number two, uses what? Gathering, uses information as gathering or gather and assessing relevant data, relevant data and information, using abstract ideas to what? To interpret them effectively. Number 3 comes to well-reasoned scientific conclusions and solutions. Testing them against what? Against some relevant criteria and standard. Until now, scientific thinker can do what? Can raise vital situation, vital scientific question, vital scientific problems, formulating them clearly. Number 2, gathers and assessing the relevant data, the relevant information, using abstract ideas to interpret them effectively. Number 3 come to reasoned scientific conclusions and solutions, testing them against relevant criteria and standards. Number 4, can think open-mindedly within convergent systems of scientific thinking, recognize and assessing scientific assumptions, implications, and practical consequence. Again, good scientific thinker can think on open-mindedly within convergent systems of scientific thinking, and recognize and assessing scientific assumptions, scientific implications, and practical consequences. And we can say also scientific thinker can communicate effectively with others in proposing solutions to some complex scientific problems. Again, communicates effectively with other in proposing some solution, some scientific solution to complex problems or complex scientific problem. This is an insightful cognitive approach in reflective thinking as the mental activity. Here doesn't involve the mechanical trials and error types of efforts. Communicates with others effectively. Communicate with others to propose some solution to complex scientific thinking. This is an insightful cognitive approach in reflective thinking as the mental activity. Here doesn't involve the mechanical trial and error type of efforts. All of that is a characteristic of scientific thinking. We can collect them in number 1, scientific thinking raises vital situation, scientific problems, scientific questions, formatting them clearly. Number 2, gathered and assessing what? Assessing scientific data and information, relevant scientific data and information, and using abstract ideas to interpret them effectively. Number 3 comes to well-reasoned. Reasoned scientific conclusion, scientific solutions, testing them also against relevant criteria and standard. Number 4, think open-mindedly within what? Within convergent systems of scientific thinking. Recognize and assessing some scientific assumptions, scientific implications, scientific and practical consequences. And finally, we can say communicate with others effectively. 2 or 4, proposing. Proposing what? Proposing solutions to complex scientific problems. This is an insightful cognitive approach to reflective thinking. In this type, as a mental activity here doesn't involve the mechanical trial and error effort or type of efforts. After we recognize about what is the meaning of scientific thinking and recognize the characteristic of scientific thinker, we can now go to one definition of scientific thinking. We say scientific thinking is a combination of what? Deductive and inductive ways of thinking. What is the meaning of that? Let's give example. If you find a person desperately running on the railway platform, someone is running desperately on the platform or on the railway platform, you could infer a number of ideas, number of thinking, such as we can say he is running to catch the train. He is running to catch the train, which is about to relieve the station. Or he wants to see off his friends sitting in the train, which is about to relieve the stations. We also can say he was or he has left his bags in the train and he wants to get in before the train leaves the station. Again, we have an example about scientific thinking. To know what is the meaning of scientific thinking is a combination of deductive and inductive ways of thinking. We have example. If you see a person desperately running on the railway platform quickly, we could infer a number of ideas, number of thinking, such as he is running to catch the train, which is about to leave the station, or he wants to see off his friends sitting in the train, which is about to leave the station. Number 3, we can say he has left his bag in the train and wants to get it off, to get in before the train leaves the stations. So, to figure out why this person is running, you could use some different kinds of reasoning. We could use some different kinds of thinking or reasoning, such as deductive and inductive thinking. Let's go to recognize how we use deductive thinking and how we use inductive thinking. We will start with deductive thinking. How can we use deductive thinking? In our example, since your previous experiences that people run on the platform or the railway platform to catch trains. To catch a train, you would conclude that this person is getting late and is running to catch the train. Depend on what? Depend on your experiences, your previous experience. Again, to solve our example, since your previous experiences, that people is running on the railway platform to catch the train before the train leaves the stations. So you would conclude that this person is getting late. So he is running to catch the train. This kind of thinking, this kind of reasoning that begins with a scientific assumptions is called the deductive thinking. Again, this type of thinking or this type of reasoning that begins with what? Begins with an assumptions is called deductive thinking. Thus, deductive thinking begins with making assumptions, general assumptions that you know or believe to be true. Again, deductive thinking begins with what? Begins with general assumptions. You know it or you believe to be true. This assumption is true. So, and then drawing a specific conclusion. Depend on what? Depend on assumptions. Okay? Again, the first type of thinking, deductive and inductive thinking in the scientific thinking. The first type we recognize about this is deductive thinking. What is the meaning of deductive thinking? Deductive thinking is a type of thinking, type of reasoning that begins with what? Begins with a general assumptions. Okay, general assumption, and then you drawing some specific conclusion based on this assumption. That is meaning we begins with a general assumption, then we draw a specific conclusion. General, then a specific. General assumption, then a specific conclusion. For example, we know that the metal is expanded by heating. Any metal expanded by heating. This is a general assumption. We can conclude from that. We can conclude what? We can conclude copper is expanded by heating. Iron is expanded by heating. Aluminum is expanded by heating. When we say as a general, metals is expanded by heating, we start with what? We start with a general assumptions. Then we drawing, depend on these assumptions, some conclusions. What conclusion? We can conclude that copper is expanded by heating, iron is expanding by heating, aluminum is expanding by heating. That is meaning when we use the deductive thinking, we begin with general conclusion, general assumption. Then we draw or conclude some specific conclusion, general to specific. That is meaning deductive thinking. In other words, it is a reason from general to particular. We think from general to particular, general assumptions to particular or specific conclusion. Your general assumptions is that, in our example, is that people run on the railway platform when they are getting late for the train. Our assumptions is what? Our assumptions, general assumptions that people run on the railway platform when what? when they are getting late, they are getting late for the train. So we can conclude a specific conclusion that in this example, the man is running on the platform, therefore he is getting late for the train. That is meaning in deductive thinking, we start with general assumptions, and then we conclude specific or particular conclusion, particular ideas, particular facts, and so on. One mistake you can making, or any one of us can making, or generally people do commit such mistaking in using deductive reason, is that they or you assume general assumptions, but don't always know if the assumptions is if the basic statements, if the basic assumption is true. We should use this cognitive or basic statement or basic assumptions is true, should be true. Why? If the base information, if the general assumptions is not true, what happen? Your conclusion will be invalid or wrong. For example, in our example, we say people is running on the platform to catch the train because they are getting late. Also, maybe people run to the platform for other reasons. So, your conclusion would be invalid or wrong. In deductive thinking, number one, we begins with general assumptions or basic information, and then conclude specific or particular information, specific or particular conclusion. But when we use deductive thinking, we should use correct assumptions, correct basic information. Because if we use some assumption not true, also our conclusion will be invalid or wrong. That is the first type of thinking, deductive thinking. When we recognize or when we define scientific thinking, we say scientific thinking is a combination of deductive and inductive ways of thinking. We recognize about the first type, deductive thinking, which we use when we begin with general assumptions or general basic information, and then conclude specific or particular conclusion, particular or specific informations, and so on. When we use deductive thinking, we should use correct basic information, correct assumptions. So when we use correct assumption, we conclude correct answer, correct conclusion, and so on. But when we use the second type of thinking, inductive thinking, another way to figure out why the man is running. Why the man is running on the platform or on the railway platform is to use inductive thinking. Inductive thinking, sometimes you would analyze other possible reasons or observe the behavior of this person. Again, When we speak about inductive, we speak about observations, we speak about some informations, some possible reasons for, in our example, why this person is running. When we use inductive thinking, you would analyze other possible reasons and observe what the man is actually doing, and then drawing a conclusion about his behavior. Again, in deductive thinking. In our example, another way to figure out why this person is running on the railway platform is to use inductive thinking. Sometimes you would analyze other possible reasons and observe what the man is actually doing, and then conclude or draw a conclusion about his behavior. Reasoning or thinking that is based on specific facts or observations is called in deductive thinking. The thinking that is based on what? Based on a specific particle or specific facts and observations is called in deductive reason. Now we say in deductive thinking, we start with what? We start with specific facts, observations, and then we conclude the conclusion. That is meaning in deductive thinking begins with a general to specific, but in deductive thinking we start with what? We start with a specific facts, specific situations, observation, specific or particle. Then we conclude the general. Again, deductive from general to particle. In deductive from particle to general. Opposite. In deductive reasoning is drawing a general conclusion. In deductive reasoning is drawing general conclusion. Based on what? Based on particular observation, particular facts. In our example, you observed the other possible reasons. We observe the other person's sequences, actions, such as enter into the train, compartment, and returning with bag. He enter into the train and returning with bag. He don't catch the train. So, based on your observation, you would conclude that the person had left his bag in the train. One mistake you would probably make here is jumping to the conclusion without knowing all possible facts. When we use inductive thinking, we shouldn't jump to conclusion. No, we should we should know all possible facts. We observe all situations, all actions to catch the good conclusion, the right conclusion. Now we recognize about what? Now we recognize about scientific thinking. We recognize about types of thinking we use in our scientific thinking, such as we use scientific thinking in logically, in systematically, in analytical, in deductive and inductive thinking. We also recognize about the mistake in deductive and mistake in deductive. We also recognize about characteristic of good or well scientific thinker, what they do. And when we recognize about scientific thinking, we recognize the ability of scientific thinking. Until now, this session, we recognize about scientific thinking. How can we define scientific thinking? What is the relationship between scientific thinking and deductive and inductive thinking? What is the relationship between scientific thinking and systematically thinking, scientific thinking and analytical thinking, scientific thinking and logical thinking? We recognize about scientific ability, which include a variety of abilities. We recognize about the difference between conductive and inductive. In next session, inshallah, we will recognize about some scientific process we do in the scientific thinking, some skills in scientific thinking. Goodbye and see you in the next session. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.